Dr. Lila Morgan wasn't expecting much that day. The Egyptian desert had always fascinated her as a quantum physicist with a particular interest in ancient history. But years of research had brought her only minor revelations. Nothing groundbreaking. That changed when her colleague Dr. Karim Hassan excitedly called her to a recently uncovered site, just outside Amarna, the ancient capital built by Pharaoh Akhenaten. "You're not going to believe what we found," Karim had said, voice tinged with awe. The heat and sand had long stripped away Lila's patience, but she rushed to the site with curiosity. As she stepped into the partially excavated temple, she felt a shift in the air. It was as though the past was reaching out to her, its secrets barely concealed beneath the surface. The walls were covered in intricate hieroglyphs, but something about them seemed off. They weren't standard inscriptions. The arrangement of the symbols felt too methodical, too precise. "Lila, look at this." Karim gestured toward the back of the chamber, where a large stone tablet stood, illuminated by the flickering light of torches. "These inscriptions don't match anything we've ever seen." Lila's eyes widened as she stepped closer. Unlike the other hieroglyphs in the temple, this tablet was carved with a strange combination of hieroglyphics and symbols that seemed almost mathematical. Beneath an image of Akhenaten, there was a diagram she couldn't immediately comprehend, a complex network of lines and shapes, intertwined like a circuit diagram. "It's a code," she murmured, running her fingers gently over the grooves in the stone. "But it's not just a message. This looks like instructions." Karim frowned. "Instructions for what?" Lila's mind raced as she took out her notebook and began sketching the symbols. She had always been intrigued by the fusion of science and ancient history, and now it seemed that the two worlds were colliding in the most unexpected way. She carefully transcribed the entire sequence, knowing that it would take time to decipher. But something deep inside her felt that this discovery was far more important than anything they had found before. Later that night, Lila sat in her tent, illuminated by the dim glow of her laptop. She ran the symbols through every known ancient language software, cross-referencing them with her knowledge of quantum theory and advanced mathematics. Hours passed as she tried to make sense of the patterns. But then something clicked. Her heart raced as she realized the inscriptions weren't merely hieroglyphs, they were quantum equations. The tablet was a blueprint for something, and based on the mathematical principles, it seemed to describe a way to manipulate time itself. "No way," she whispered to herself. "This can't be real." But the equations were too precise, too complex to be coincidental. Could it be that the ancient Egyptians had known something about time travel? Or had someone else, someone from the future, left this knowledge behind? Her pulse quickened as she continued her work. Line by line, she decoded the tablet until it revealed the final piece. A location deep within the desert, marked as the place where the device was buried. The next morning, Lila gathered a small team and set out on a journey to the coordinates she had decoded. They traveled for hours under the scorching sun until they arrived at a hidden valley, obscured by the surrounding cliffs. There, in the sand, they found a small stone structure, long buried beneath centuries of desert storms. Inside, Lila found it, a strange metallic object covered in symbols that matched the ones on the tablet. It looked ancient, but it also had a sleek, almost futuristic design, as though it was both out of place and out of time. "This is it," Lila whispered, her hands trembling as she examined the device. It pulsed with a faint bluish light, as though it had been waiting for her to activate it. Without hesitation, she touched the central panel. The device whirred to life, and in an instant, the world around her shifted. When Lila opened her eyes, she was no longer in the desert. She stood in the middle of a grand palace, its walls adorned with golden hieroglyphs, its floors polished to a gleaming shine. The air was filled with the scent of incense, and the sound of distant music echoed through the halls. Her heart raced as she realized where she was, ancient Egypt, during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Lila quickly hid behind a pillar as a group of priests passed by, their elaborate robes trailing behind them. She had traveled through time, just as the device had promised. But why? What was she supposed to do here? As she tried to make sense of her situation, she noticed something strange. Among the priests, she saw a figure that didn't belong. A tall man wearing modern clothing, quietly giving orders to the others. She felt a chill run down her spine. Time travelers just like her. She followed the group through the palace until they entered the throne room, where Akhenaten himself sat, surrounded by advisors and scribes. The modern man stepped forward and spoke in perfect Egyptian, but Leila could hear the distinct inflection of someone who wasn't from this time. The timeline must be preserved, the man said. You cannot deviate from the plan. Akhenaten nodded solemnly, as if this were a conversation they had had many times before. Leila's mind raced. What plan? What timeline? Suddenly, the man glanced in her direction, and their eyes met. His expression shifted from calm authority to alarm, and he quickly whispered something to one of the priests. Leila knew she had to get out of there. She turned and ran, ducking through the palace halls until she found a secluded chamber. There, she caught her breath and tried to make sense of what she had just seen. There were more time travelers here, and they were influencing Pharaoh Akhenaten's decisions. But why? And who were they? Before she could contemplate further, a voice echoed from the shadows. You shouldn't be here. Leila turned to see a woman step forward, dressed in traditional Egyptian garb, but with an unmistakable air of someone who didn't belong in this time either. Her eyes were sharp, her posture commanding. Who are you? Leila asked, her voice barely a whisper. The woman stepped closer. The real question is, why are you here? This time is fragile, and every action could have devastating consequences. Leila's mind swirled with questions, but she focused on the most pressing one. What's happening here? Why are time travelers influencing Pharaoh Akhenaten? The woman's gaze hardened. There are factions, those who wish to control history for their own gain, and those who wish to protect it. Akhenaten's reign is a pivotal point in human history, and if the wrong side wins, the timeline as we know it could collapse. Leila felt a knot form in her stomach. And which side are you on? The woman paused, studying her carefully. I'm on the side of preserving the timeline, but I can't do it alone. Leila knew she had a choice to make. She hadn't asked to be a part of this, but now that she was here, she couldn't walk away. The fate of history itself was at stake. I'll help you, Leila said, her voice steady. But I need to know everything. The woman nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. Then let's start with the truth about Akhenaten, and the reason time travelers have been fighting over this era for centuries. As Leila followed the mysterious woman deeper into the palace, she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey had only just begun. The past was far more complicated than she had ever imagined, and now, she was caught in the middle of a battle that would determine the future of humanity. Leila's heart raced as she followed the mysterious woman through the labyrinthine halls of Pharaoh Akhenaten's palace. The deeper they went, the more the walls seemed to close in around her, ancient stone and flickering torchlight amplifying the weight of the moment. She still couldn't believe that she had traveled through time, or that she was now embroiled in a conflict that spanned millennia. The woman led her to a hidden chamber, far from the palace's main halls. Once inside, she pulled a heavy tapestry aside, revealing a small alcove that contained a series of strange, glowing crystals, arranged in a pattern Leila couldn't quite understand. These are temporal beacons, the woman explained, kneeling before them. They allow us to monitor fluctuations in the timeline and help us detect any tampering by rival factions. Leila stared at the crystals, mesmerized. So, you're part of a group that protects the timeline? Like Time Police? The woman smirked. It's more complicated than that. We don't enforce laws. We're more like guardians, trying to ensure that key events happen as they should. Some of those events include the rise and fall of pharaohs. Leila frowned. And Akhenaten's reign is one of those key events? More than you know, the woman said, her tone grave. Akhenaten's religious revolution, the shift to monotheism, his worship of Aten, wasn't just a political or theological move. It was a turning point in human consciousness. It affected how future generations would think, how they would approach power and belief. There are those who wish to manipulate this moment for their own ends. Leila's mind spun as she tried to piece everything together. But why Akhenaten? And why now? The woman stood, folding her arms. Akhenaten was more than a pharaoh. He was one of the few humans who had a natural understanding of the flow of time. He saw things that others couldn't, felt the ripples of time. That's why certain factions are drawn to him. They believe if they can control him, they can control the timeline. Leila swallowed, the gravity of the situation hitting her all at once. Who are these factions? There are many, the woman replied, but the most dangerous are from a distant future, centuries beyond even your time. They seek to control the past, so they can rewrite their own present. We call them the Chronos faction. Chronos? Leila echoed, her voice barely a whisper. They've been influencing Egypt for years. Subtly at first, the woman continued. But recently, they've become more aggressive. They've infiltrated Akhenaten's court, pushing him to make decisions that will have catastrophic consequences for the future. Leila remembered the man she'd seen earlier, the one giving orders to the priests in modern clothing. I saw one of them, she said. He was speaking to Akhenaten in the throne room. The woman's eyes darkened. Then they've already made their move. We're running out of time. What do we do? Leila asked, her voice filled with urgency. The woman paused, as if weighing her options. We have to stop them. But first, you need to understand the full scope of their plan. She gestured toward a low stone table in the corner of the chamber. Upon it lay a series of scrolls, each covered in a mix of hieroglyphics and strange, futuristic symbols. Leila approached the table cautiously. What are these? Documents left behind by other time travelers, the woman explained. They contain details about the Chronos faction's plans and how they've been altering history. We believe they're trying to create a singular timeline, one where they hold ultimate power. Leila's stomach twisted. But wouldn't that destroy other timelines? The woman nodded. Exactly. They want to collapse all alternate timelines into one. But doing so would destabilize reality itself. The paradoxes alone could tear the fabric of time apart. Leila's hand hovered over one of the scrolls, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. What's your name? She asked, realizing she still didn't know who this mysterious woman was. Ania, the woman replied, her expression softening slightly. I'm from your future, but only by a few decades. My people have been fighting the Chronos faction for years. We've managed to slow them down, but now they're getting desperate. They're using this moment in history, Akhenaten's reign, as a fulcrum to shift everything in their favor. Leila nodded, absorbing the information. And what about me? Why was I sent here? Ania studied her for a moment, then gave a faint smile. You're here because the timeline needs you. You weren't supposed to activate that device, but now that you have, you're a part of this. Leila let out a shaky breath. Great. No pressure, right? Ania chuckled. You'll be fine. You have the knowledge to help us stop them. Before Leila could respond, a deep rumbling sound echoed through the palace, shaking the walls. The crystals in the alcove flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the chamber. Ania's face hardened. They're here. Without another word, she grabbed Leila's arm and pulled her out of the chamber, leading her down a series of narrow corridors. As they ran, Leila could hear the distant sounds of shouting, guards, priests, and something else, a deep unnatural hum, like the sound of a machine. When they reached the throne room, Leila saw the source of the noise. The man she had seen earlier, the time traveler, was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by priests and soldiers. But now he wasn't alone. A group of others, all dressed in strange futuristic armor, stood beside him, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the crystals in Ania's chamber. You're too late, the man said, his voice cold and menacing. The timeline is already shifting. Akhenaten's reign will be ours to control. Ania stepped forward, her hand gripping a small, silver device that pulsed with energy. Not if I have anything to say about it. The man sneered. You're outnumbered. You can't stop us. Leila's heart pounded in her chest as she stood beside Ania, unsure of what to do. But she knew one thing. She couldn't let the Chronos faction win. If they succeeded, the timeline would collapse, and the future as she knew it would be lost. Ania glanced at Leila. We need to disrupt their control. You saw the device earlier, the one that sent you here. It's a temporal anchor. If we can overload it, we can reset the timeline and send them back. Leila nodded, her mind racing. But how do we do that? Ania handed her the silver device. This will create a temporal pulse, but you'll need to get close enough to the anchor to activate it. Leila swallowed hard. And what happens after that? Ania's eyes were steely. Then we fight. Without another word, Leila slipped the device into her pocket and darted toward the back of the room, where the strange glowing machine sat, the temporal anchor that had brought her to this time. She could feel the energy radiating off of it, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. As she neared the anchor, one of the Chronos soldiers spotted her and raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Anya leaped forward, tackling him to the ground. "Now Leila!" Anya shouted. With trembling hands, Leila pulled the silver device from her pocket and pressed the activation button. The room was suddenly filled with a blinding flash of light, and a wave of energy rippled through the air, distorting the space around them. The temporal anchor whirred violently, sparks flying from its surface as it began to overload. Leila stumbled back, shielding her eyes from the searing light. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was Anya, standing defiantly in the midst of the chaos, her eyes locked on the man from the Chronos faction. And then there was silence. Leila awoke to the sound of wind. She was back in the desert, lying on the sand beneath a cloudless sky. The palace, the soldiers, the time travelers, it was all gone. She sat up, her head spinning. The device was still in her hand, but it was no longer glowing. The temporal pulse had worked. But as she looked around, she realized something wasn't right. The landscape was different. The sand dunes had shifted, and the ruins of Akhenaten's palace were nowhere to be seen. Leila's heart sank as she understood what had happened. The timeline had reset, but it wasn't the same as before. Something had changed. And now, she was stranded in an unfamiliar past, with no way of knowing if she could ever return home. Leila stood, her legs unsteady as the weight of her new reality sank in. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the world around her seemed eerily still, as if time itself was holding its breath. She scanned the horizon for any sign of life, but all she saw were endless sand dunes stretching as far as the eye could see. Her mind raced. The temporal pulse had worked. She had overloaded the anchor and disrupted the Chronos faction's control. But now, she was trapped in a timeline that felt off wrong somehow. The palace, the bustling city, even the distant Nile, all had vanished, leaving her stranded in an empty desert. Leila's throat tightened as she clutched the silver device that Anya had given her. It no longer pulsed with energy, it was inert. Her only lifeline to return home, or even find Anya, was now nothing more than a cold piece of metal. "I have to move," she whispered to herself, her voice shaky. "I can't stay here." With no clear direction, Leila chose a path and began walking, her mind churning with questions. How far back in time was she now? Had the timeline been altered so drastically that she was in a completely different era? Or had the pulse simply displaced her to some remote part of Egypt? As she trudged through the sand, the sun scorching her back, Leila tried to focus on the problem at hand. She had to find someone, anyone who could help her figure out where, and more importantly when she was. But the desolate landscape offered no clues. Hours passed, and exhaustion weighed heavy on her limbs. The vast desert seemed endless, and with no water, no food, and no shelter, Leila knew she couldn't last much longer. She paused to rest, her legs trembling beneath her, as she collapsed onto the hot sand. For the first time since arriving in this strange place, a feeling of hopelessness crept in. She closed her eyes, her mind swirling with thoughts of her life back in the 21st century, the research lab, her colleagues, the mundane comfort of modern technology. It all seemed so distant now, like a dream she couldn't quite grasp. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence. Faint at first, but growing louder, a rhythmic pounding, like the steady beat of drums. Leila's eyes snapped open, and she scrambled to her feet. In the distance, she saw movement, figures approaching over the crest of a sand dune. Her heart leaped with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She wasn't alone. As the figures drew closer, Leila's eyes widened. A group of warriors marched toward her, their bronze weapons glinting in the sun. They were dressed in garments she recognized from her studies: linen kilts, leather sandals, and heavy adornments of gold and lapis lazuli. At their head was a tall man, his features sharp and commanding, with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. The warriors stopped a few feet from where she stood, and the leader stepped forward. His gaze swept over her with curiosity and caution. "You're not from here," he said, his voice deep and resonant. Who are you? And how did you come to be in the desert? Leila hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She didn't know if these people were friend or foe, but there was no point in lying. She was clearly an outsider. My name is Leila, she said, her voice hoarse from thirst. I'm not sure how I got here. I was in Akhenaten's time. But something went wrong. The timeline shifted. The man's eyes narrowed. Akhenaten? The heretic king? He exchanged glances with the warriors behind him before turning back to her. You speak of times long past, stranger. Akhenaten's reign ended many generations ago. Leila's breath caught in her throat. What? How long ago? The man studied her for a moment, then motioned for one of his soldiers to step forward. The warrior handed Leila a water skin, and she drank greedily, her mind racing. The heretic Pharaoh's fall is ancient history, the leader said. You must have traveled far from your homeland if you do not know this. But we do not have time for stories. You will come with us. Leila wiped her mouth, feeling a chill run through her despite the heat. Where are you taking me? The man's gaze hardened. To the temple of Sekhmet. There the priests may decide what is to be done with you. With no other options, Leila nodded and allowed herself to be led by the warriors. As they marched through the desert, her mind was reeling. If Akhenaten's reign was now ancient history, that meant she had traveled far beyond the period she had originally been sent to, perhaps centuries ahead. The consequences of the temporal pulse had been far more drastic than she had anticipated. The journey was long, and as they neared their destination, Leila saw the faint outline of a temple rising out of the dunes. Its tall columns were etched with intricate carvings, and statues of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and healing, flanked the entrance. The sight of the temple stirred something in Leila, a sense that whatever awaited her inside was tied to the strange fate that had brought her here. As they entered the temple, the cool air provided a brief respite from the sweltering heat. The interior was dimly lit, with torches casting flickering shadows on the walls. Priests, adorned in elaborate robes, moved about, tending to altars and performing rituals. The leader of the warriors approached a tall figure draped in white and gold, a high priest, by the looks of him. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, filled with an intense curiosity as he observed Leila. She claims to be from a time of the heretic Pharaoh, the leader said, his tone laced with skepticism. But she speaks in strange ways, and there is something unnatural about her. The high priest stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized her. Tell me, child, what do you know of the flow of time? Leila swallowed hard, unsure of how much to say. But the look in the priest's eyes told her that this man already knew far more than she expected. I'm a physicist, she said slowly. I study the nature of time and space. I accidentally activated a device that sent me here. But now, I don't know how far I've come, or if I can ever return. The priest raised an eyebrow. A device, you say? And this device, did it come from the hands of the Chronos? Leila's eyes widened in shock. You know about the Chronos faction? The priest nodded solemnly. They have been meddling in the affairs of Egypt for far longer than you realize. We of the priesthood have fought to protect the balance of time, but they are relentless. Their reach extends even into the future. Leila's heart pounded. Then you know how dangerous they are. They're trying to rewrite history. The priest's expression darkened. Yes, and if they succeed, the consequences will be unimaginable. Leila took a step forward, her desperation growing. Please, if you know how to fight them, you have to help me. I was sent here to stop them, but I'm trapped in this timeline. The high priest studied her for a long moment before speaking. There may be a way for you to return to your time, but it will not be easy. The Chronos faction has woven themselves into the fabric of this era, and undoing their influence will require great sacrifice. Leila nodded, her resolve strengthening. I'll do whatever it takes. The high priest gestured for her to follow him deeper into the temple. Come then. There is something you must see. As they descended into the depths of the temple, the air grew cooler, and the flickering torchlight cast eerie shadows on the stone walls. Leila could feel the weight of ancient secrets pressing down on her, and a sense of foreboding settled in her chest. At last, they arrived at a large chamber, its walls lined with carvings of gods and pharaohs. In the center of the room stood an altar, upon which rested a small, intricate device, one that pulsed with a faint, otherworldly glow. This, the high priest said, his voice reverent, is the hourglass of the ages. It is a relic of the ancient ones who first learned to bend time to their will. With it, you may be able to return to your time, or even undo the damage the Chronos faction has caused. Leila stared at the device, her heart racing. The weight of her mission pressed down on her. The fate of time itself was in her hands, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. But she had come too far to turn back now. Leila stood before the hourglass of the ages, its faint, otherworldly glow casting an eerie light across the chamber. Her hands trembled as she reached out, feeling the pulse of temporal energy coursing through the ancient relic. This was it, her last hope. If she could unlock the secrets of the hourglass, she might be able to return to her own time, stop the Chronos faction, and restore the timeline before everything unraveled. The high priest, standing beside her, watched in silence. His eyes, though weary with age, held a deep understanding of the power she was about to wield. This hourglass, Leila began, her voice barely above a whisper. How does it work? The high priest's voice was low and deliberate. The hourglass of the ages is not merely a tool to travel through time. It is a nexus, a point of convergence where the threads of time intersect. The sands within it represent the lives, events, and destinies of all who have ever lived or will live. To use it is to risk becoming entangled in the web of time itself. Leila's stomach churned at the thought. But I have no choice. The Chronos faction has already altered too much. I have to set things right. The high priest nodded. You must be careful. If you lose control, you could tear apart the very fabric of time. The key is focus. Your will must be stronger than the currents of history that seek to pull you under. Leila inhaled deeply, steeling herself for what was to come. She had faced the Chronos faction, fought through time itself, and now stood on the edge of history's greatest secret. She couldn't falter now. How do I begin? She asked. The high priest placed his hands on the hourglass and began to chant in a language Leila couldn't recognize. An ancient tongue, perhaps lost to time itself. The sands inside the hourglass began to stir, swirling faster and faster as the priest's voice rose in intensity. Leila felt a strange pull, as if the very air around her was shifting. She stepped closer, her hand hovering above the hourglass, and then, without hesitation, she placed her palm on its surface. A jolt of energy surged through her body, and suddenly, everything went dark. When Leila opened her eyes, she found herself standing in a vast, empty space. There were no walls, no sky, just an endless void filled with swirling, shimmering lights. She looked down and realized she was standing on nothing, floating in the center of this strange, cosmic expanse. In the distance, she could see the faint outlines of figures, ghostly images flickering in and out of existence. As she squinted, she realized they were moments from the past and future, flashing by in quick succession. Pharaohs leading their armies, scholars poring over ancient texts, children playing in bustling city streets. And there, amidst it all, she saw herself, her past, present, and future selves, all connected by a fragile thread of time. This is the heart of the hourglass, a voice echoed through the void. Leila spun around to see Ania standing before her, her expression calm yet solemn. But there was something different about her, an agelessness that hadn't been there before. Ania? Leila asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. How are you here? Ania smiled faintly. I have always been here, Leila. I am a guardian of time, as much a part of this place as the sands that flow within the hourglass. I have been guiding you from the beginning. Leila felt a mix of confusion and anger. Why didn't you tell me? You let me believe you were just another agent trying to fix the timeline. Because you needed to find your strength, Ania replied softly. The power to protect the timeline was always within you, Leila. But you had to discover it for yourself. Leila shook her head. But the Chronos faction are merely a symptom of a greater imbalance, Ania interrupted. Their meddling is dangerous, yes, but they are not the root of the problem. Time is fragile, and it has been fraying for millennia. Ever since the first human looked to the stars and wondered about the future. The hourglass is both the key and the lock. If you can master it, you can restore balance. Leila clenched her fists, determination surging within her. Then show me what I have to do. Ania nodded and gestured toward the swirling lights. You must walk through the strands of time and find the moments the Chronos faction has tampered with. Each one will appear as a knot, a distortion in the natural flow of events. Untangle the knots, and the timeline will begin to heal. Leila hesitated. And if I fail? Then the timeline will collapse, Ania said, her voice heavy with the weight of the truth. And all of history will unravel. Leila swallowed hard, the enormity of the task pressing down on her. But she had come too far to turn back now. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, into the shimmering threads of time. As Leila moved through the strands of history, the knots became more visible. The first knot she encountered was from the reign of Akhenaten, where the Chronos faction had manipulated the pharaoh's religious reforms to create instability, ensuring that his vision of a monotheistic Egypt would fail. Leila reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the knot. With a gentle tug, she began to unravel it, and the timeline shifted around her. Suddenly, she was standing in the palace of Akhenaten, watching as the pharaoh spoke passionately to his people about the one true God, Aten. But this time, there was no interference. The people's reactions were genuine, and though there was resistance, it was not manipulated by future agents. The knot dissolved, and Leila felt a rush of relief. One distortion had been corrected. She continued her journey, encountering more knots, each representing a moment in history where the Chronos faction had altered the course of events. She saw Cleopatra's alliances, the rise of the Ptolemies, the construction of the Great Pyramids. In each instance, the Chronos faction had subtly inserted themselves, steering events toward their own ends. With each knot she untangled, Leila felt the timeline growing stronger, more stable. But the task was grueling, and the weight of history pressed down on her like never before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Leila reached the final knot. This one was different, larger, more tangled, and pulsing with an ominous energy. It was the source of the timeline's instability, the Chronos faction's greatest distortion. As Leila approached, she saw herself, the version of her that had first activated the temporal device, unknowingly triggering the chain of events that had led to this moment. The Chronos faction had used her as a pawn, manipulating her curiosity and ambition to their advantage. With trembling hands, Leila reached for the knot. She hesitated for a moment, knowing that untying it would undo everything. Her journey, her discovery of time travel, even her encounter with Akhenaten. But it was the only way to restore balance. She closed her eyes and pulled. The world around her dissolved into light, and for a brief moment, Leila felt as if she were floating in a sea of stars. Then, just as suddenly, she was back in the desert, standing where it had all begun. The palace, the warriors, the temple of Sekhmet, it was all gone. The hourglass was gone too, its work complete. Leila looked down at the sand beneath her feet, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. The timeline had been restored. The Chronos faction's influence had been erased, and history would now follow its natural course. But as she stood there, alone in the desert, she realized something else. She was free. No longer bound by the weight of time. She had the chance to live her life as she chose, without the burden of history pressing down on her. With one last look at the horizon, Leila turned and began to walk, leaving the past and the future behind.